I've dealt with HOA nonsense before. Letters in my mailbox for unapproved landscaping, neighbors whispering that I was a rule breaker, and even bogus threats about towing my truck. But nothing prepared me for the day. They targeted my service dog. That morning started like any other. The lake was calm, sunlight glinting across the water, and Ranger trotted beside me, his vest snug on his shoulders as we made our way down to the dock. Ranger had been with me for 3 years, trained to help me manage a medical condition that can strike without warning. He's not just a dog, he's my lifeline. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it, or so I thought. As we rounded the bend near the walking trail, I saw her, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. She stood there with her ever-present clipboard and her perpetual sneer, staring at us, like we'd just trespassed on sacred ground. Normally, I ignored her. It was easier that way, but today was different. When Ranger paused to sniff near the mailbox post, on my property line, mind you, Karen whipped something out of her oversized purse. It was a spray bottle, and before I could process what was happening, she aimed it straight at Ranger and let loose a mist of harsh, chemical-smelling liquid. The yelp that tore out of Ranger cut through me like a knife. He stumbled, shaking his head, pawing at his eyes, while Karen barked something about rules and uncontrolled animals. I didn't hear her words. All I could hear was the panicked whine of my dog as his body trembled beside me. My hands shook as I grabbed him, guiding him back toward the house. The smell of the chemical clung to his fur, sharp and toxic, making my throat burn. Inside, I rinsed his coat as best I could, heart pounding as I watched the redness flare around his eyes. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Up until then, I'd played it calm. I'd ignored the letters, the threats, the passive-aggressive comments from the HOA president and her cronies. But this was different. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd set it on fire. I called my vet first. Ranger needed to be checked immediately. The vet confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever Karen had sprayed was a harsh cleaning chemical, something that could have caused serious burns or even respiratory damage if I hadn't washed it off quickly. Then I called my lawyer, and finally, I called the police. Because what Karen didn't know, and what I was about to make very clear, was that harming a service animal isn't just cruel. It's a federal crime. As I sat there that evening, Ranger curled against my leg, still trembling, I realized this wasn't going to be another quiet battle. This wasn't just about HOA drama or petty power trips anymore. This was about justice for Ranger and for every time they'd tried to bully me into submission. The HOA had picked the wrong fight, and I was done backing down. By the next morning, the quiet hum of the lake community was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a police cruiser rolling up the gravel road. Its tires crunched slowly, deliberately, until it stopped right in front of my driveway. Ranger lifted, his head from where he'd been resting beside me on the porch, his tail thumping weakly, still unsure but comforted by my steady hand on his neck. I'd already been on the phone with the sheriff's office twice since the attack, providing details, handing over the vet's written report, and explaining, carefully, that Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a federally recognized medical service animal, trained and certified, and what had been done to him wasn't a petty neighborhood dispute. It was a federal offense. The officer stepped out, a tall man with a calm voice and a badge that carried weight. He didn't rush. He didn't make small talk. He simply asked to see Ranger, to understand what had happened. I showed him the lingering redness around Ranger's eyes, the way he still flinched at sudden movements, and I handed over the empty plastic bag with the towel I'd used the night before. Still damp, still reeking of the chemical spray. He took one look at that, and his jaw tightened. The questions came next, sharp but steady. Did I see the person who sprayed him? Was I certain of her identity? Did anyone else witness it? And with every answer, I could see the weight of the situation settling heavier in his posture. I'd barely finished my statement when another cruiser arrived. And then another. By noon, there were 3 police cars lined up in front of the neighborhood office, the little cabin where the HOA ran their petty empire. Neighbors came out of their homes, pretending to check mail or water plants, their eyes locked on the cluster of uniforms that had descended on the quiet lakefront street. Whispers traveled faster than sound. What happened? Who called the cops? And then they saw Karen. She was standing on her porch, arms folded, chin tilted high like a queen, daring anyone to question her throne. Even when the officers approached her, badges out, voices firm, she didn't flinch. She launched into one of her tirades, waving her arms, pointing down the road toward my cabin. Her words sharp and venomous. But here's the thing about the law. It doesn't care how many years you've been president of a homeowners association, or how many petty fines you've written, or how many people you've bullied into silence. It too cares about facts, evidence, and intent. The officers had all 3. Within minutes, the tone shifted. Karen's bluster faltered. Her words trailed off into nervous laughter, then stammered excuses. I couldn't hear everything from my porch, but I caught enough to know when the gravity of the situation finally landed. Because harming a service animal isn't just assault. It's a federal crime, punishable by hefty fines and even jail time. And when the officers explained that to her, calmly, firmly, something in her posture changed. Neighbors who'd been pretending not to stare suddenly had front-row seats to the sight of the HOA president, red-faced and trembling, being told exactly how deep the hole she dug for herself really was. By late afternoon, the officers were at my door again. They'd taken statements, collected evidence, and assured me the case would be escalated to the state investigator for animal cruelty and federal service animal protection violations. One officer, younger than the rest but with the same steady demeanor, looked down at Ranger, who was curled quietly by my feet, and said something that stuck with me. He's got rights, just like you, and we're going to make sure they're enforced. For the first time since that awful moment on the trail, I felt a sliver of relief. But Karen? She was unraveling. By evening, the HOA sent out one of their infamous emails, thinly veiled legal jargon about community misunderstandings, accusing certain residents of escalating personal disputes into unnecessary legal matters. It was the kind of desperate spin you'd expect from someone who'd just realized they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. What Karen didn't understand, though, was that this wasn't a matter of neighborhood politics anymore. This wasn't about who mowed their lawn too high or who parked where they shouldn't. This was about the law, and the law had a very clear message. You don't touch a service animal. Not ever. By the next morning, the ripples of her mistake were everywhere. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact with me were suddenly stopping by, dropping off treats for Ranger, offering quiet words of support, some even apologizing for not speaking up sooner when they'd seen how far the HOA had gone in their petty crusades. And Ranger, sweet and forgiving as ever, wagged his tail for each of them, even though he still flinched at the sound of a spray, bottle, or the slam of a car door. I documented everything: photos of his injuries, the vet's medical report, screenshots of the HOA email, Even the comments from neighbors who'd watched her target us for months, every piece of it went straight to my attorney, who was already building a case stronger than steel. Because this wasn't going to end with an apology. This was going to end with accountability. And deep down, I think Karen knew it. That afternoon, I caught sight of her SUV creeping past my driveway. She didn't stop. She didn't roll down the window. But the way her eyes darted toward my porch, toward Ranger sitting calmly beside me, told me everything. For the first time in years, she wasn't the predator, she was the one being watched. By the end of that week, the quiet little lake community wasn't quiet anymore. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was under investigation for assaulting a federally protected service dog. People whispered about it in the coffee shop in town, at the grocery store, even at the little bait shop down by the marina. Neighbors who once jumped at her every command now crossed the street to avoid her. And every time she stepped outside, she was met with the sharp sting of silence, the kind that cuts deeper than words. But the fallout was just beginning. 3 days after the incident, a black SUV with government plates rolled slowly through the community gates. It wasn't the sheriff this time, it was a federal investigator. The kind of investigator who doesn't care about petty neighborhood drama or Karen's endless web of excuses. I watched from my porch as the agent, sharp suit and badge glinting in the afternoon light, knocked on her door. There was a brief exchange, short, tense, and then, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Karen didn't have a speech ready. Because the law didn't care that she was protecting the community. It cared that she'd targeted a service animal, and that, by every definition of the law, was a federal crime. The investigator wasn't alone for long. 2 days later, animal control officers arrived with cameras and clipboards, photographing the stretch of trail where the attack had happened, taking samples of the grass where the chemical spray had pooled. They talked to neighbors, collected statements, and walked away with a list of violations that stretched longer than any HOA newsletter Karen had ever sent. By then, the facade Karen had built over the years of power, control, untouchable authority was starting to crack. The first fissure came during the weekly HOA meeting. Normally, those meetings were standing room only, filled with people desperate to stay on her good side. That night, only a handful showed up, and even those few refused to meet her eye. Halfway through her opening speech, something about misinformation campaigns and jealous neighbors, one of the longtime residents, a quiet man who'd never spoken up before, stood and calmly said what everyone else had been thinking. "We're done," and then he walked out. Others followed. By the end of the week, 3 board members had resigned. They didn't bother with formal statements. They simply packed up their folders and disappeared. The once feared enforcement committee was suddenly silent. The endless stream of violation notices stopped. The so-called community patrols, her fake little army with their clipboards and cheap uniforms, vanished overnight. It was like watching an empire collapse in slow motion. And through it all, Ranger healed. The vet cleared him for light activity. After a week, though I could still see the hesitation in his eyes. Loud noises made him flinch, and every time we passed that stretch of trail, his pace slowed, his ears pinned back. But he was trying. Every day, he was trying. I started documenting his progress in a small notebook, his appetite, his energy, the gradual fading of the redness around his eyes, not just for the case, but because I needed to see the proof that we were moving forward. The case itself was gathering momentum. My attorney called almost daily with updates. Federal charges were being prepared. the local DA was reviewing the evidence for additional animal cruelty counts, and the HOA's insurance company had quietly started distancing themselves from Karen, clearly sensing the storm that was coming. And it was a storm, because once the investigation went public, the media came knocking. First, it was a local news crew, then a regional station, and finally a national outlet, looking to do a segment on service animal rights featuring Ranger. I didn't give interviews, I wasn't interested in the attention, but the story spread anyway. And with it came something I hadn't expected: support. Emails from strangers across the country offering words of encouragement. Packages arriving at my P.O. box. Treats, toys, even hand-sewn vests for Ranger, each with notes thanking him for his service and wishing him a speedy recovery. It was humbling, and in a way, it reminded me why this fight mattered. Because it wasn't just about me, or even about Ranger. It was about drawing a line that people like Karen couldn't cross. And every day, that line got a little clearer. Meanwhile, Karen's world was shrinking. The same neighbors who used to jump when she called now ignored her emails. The contractors she'd hired to maintain her property quietly stopped showing up. Even her allies on the board stopped defending her, their silence louder than any public statement. I'd see her sometimes, driving past my cabin in her shiny SUV, slowing just enough to glare toward the porch where Ranger and I sat in the mornings. But the power she used to wield with that glare was gone. Because now, she wasn't the one people feared. She was the one they pitied. By the third week, the HOA itself was in chaos. Without its figurehead barking orders, everything ground to a halt. Bills went unpaid. Maintenance requests piled up. The gate malfunctioned one afternoon, and instead of the usual flurry of emails blaming residents, there was nothing but silence. And through that silence, something new started to grow. Neighbors who'd been strangers began talking to each other, organizing their own solutions. A retired electrician fixed the gate. A group of teens cleaned up the park. Someone mowed the common area without being told, and nobody complained about liability or unauthorized activity. For the first time in years, the community felt like a community. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the pain or the fear, but it was a start. And in the middle of it all, I stayed focused. I kept documenting. I kept working with my attorney. I kept making sure every step of Ranger's recovery was recorded, every piece of evidence preserved, every deadline met. Because the case was building into something bigger than anyone had expected. Bigger than Karen. Bigger than the HOA. This was about precedent, about sending a message that what happened here couldn't be brushed off as just a neighborhood dispute. By the end of the month, the federal investigator called with an update. The case was moving forward. Indictments were being prepared. There would be hearings, and likely, there would be consequences Karen couldn't talk her way out of. When, I hung up the phone that night, Ranger was curled up at my feet, his breathing steady, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. And for the first time since that awful day, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, justice was finally coming. The day of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning where the lake sat still, reflecting the overcast sky like a sheet of steel. Ranger rested his head on my knee as I drank my coffee, his steady breathing a reminder of why I was walking into that courtroom in the first place. The courthouse sat 2 towns over, a square stone building that had seen generations of drama and law carved into its walls. By the time I arrived, the place was already buzzing. Reporters lingered on the steps, their cameras poised, while neighbors clustered in quiet groups along the sidewalk, whispering behind cupped hands. Karen arrived fashionably late, of course, sweeping up the steps in her usual purple suit, only, this time, her confident stride was gone. Her face was pale, lips pressed thin, her eyes darting toward the cameras before quickly turning away. Flanked by a lawyer who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, she kept her chin high, but the cracks in her composure were there for everyone to see. Inside, the courtroom was cool and quiet, the hum of whispered conversations echoing off the wood-paneled walls. I took my seat near the front, documents in hand, my attorney calm and collected beside me. Ranger, officially registered to accompany me, sat at my feet, his vest snug, his presence steady and grounding. When the judge entered, the room hushed to silence. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority without effort. She read through the charges, each one landing like a stone dropped in water. Animal cruelty. Assault on a federally protected service animal. Reckless endangerment. Each word seemed to chip away at whatever shred of arrogance Karen had clung to. By the time the prosecutor began outlining the evidence, her face had gone ashen. The vet's report was first, detailed, clinical, and impossible to argue with. Photos of Ranger's inflamed eyes and irritated skin were displayed on a screen, the room going still as the reality of what had been done sank in. Then came the chemical analysis. The spray bottle Karen had used, retrieved from her trash by investigators, tested positive for a high-concentration cleaner not approved for public use. The kind that could have caused permanent damage if it had gotten into Ranger's lungs or bloodstream. The prosecutor didn't sensationalize. They didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. I'd been prepared for Karen's lawyer to spin some story, to paint her as a misunderstood neighbor just trying to enforce community standards. And sure enough, when their turn came, that's exactly what they tried. They called her a pillar of the neighborhood, a volunteer, someone who had simply overstepped in an attempt to keep order. But the judge wasn't buying it, because the law was clear. Harming a service animal is a federal offense. Intentional or not, ignorance or malice, it didn't matter. The act itself was criminal. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my words simple. I explained what Ranger meant to me, not just as a companion, but as a lifeline. I explained what it was like to hear him yelp in pain, to watch him shake and tremble in fear for days afterward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried more weight than anger ever could. When I sat down, the room was silent. Every eye fixed on the woman who'd spent years lording her power over the neighborhood. And for the first time, she had nothing to say. The hearing stretched on through the afternoon, each piece of evidence building a case so airtight that even her lawyer stopped trying to argue. By the time the judge called for a recess, the outcome felt inevitable. During that break, I stepped outside, letting the cool air fill my lungs as Ranger pressed close to my leg. Neighbors approached quietly, some offering handshakes, others simply nodding in silent solidarity. People I'd barely spoken to in years, people who had once been too afraid to cross Karen, were suddenly standing beside me, because this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a reckoning for an entire community. When court resumed, the judge's tone left no room for interpretation. She spoke firmly, clearly, outlining the seriousness of the crimes, the legal precedent, and the consequences. Fines, mandatory restitution, and a looming possibility of jail time. Karen didn't flinch when the words were read, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her. By the time the session adjourned, the weight of it all had settled over the room. This wasn't the dramatic outburst people had expected. There were no shouting matches, no explosive moments, just the quiet, heavy truth of accountability finally catching up to someone who had spent years believing she was untouchable. Outside, the reporters swarmed. I didn't speak to them, didn't offer sound bites or statements. This wasn't about attention. It was about Ranger. It was about justice. That night, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch with Ranger curled at my feet, the lake calm and quiet under the moonlight. The phone buzzed constantly. Texts from neighbors, updates from my attorney, even messages from strangers offering support. But I ignored it all. Because for the first time since that awful day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The fight wasn't over. There would be sentencing, follow-up hearings, and plenty of paperwork. But the tide had turned, and for Karen, the empire she'd built on fear and intimidation was crumbling faster than even I had imagined. Neighbors were already talking about dissolving the HOA entirely, about starting fresh without the shadow of her influence hanging over every decision. Volunteers were stepping up to handle maintenance, to organize events, to rebuild the sense of community that had been missing for so long. And through it all, Ranger healed. Each day he grew more confident, his tail wagging higher, his steps surer. The redness faded, the flinches grew less frequent, and slowly the sparkle returned to his eyes. Watching him, I realized something important. This fight had never really been about me. It had been about him, about protecting the creature who had given me safety, companionship, and trust without ever asking for anything in return. And now, standing in the quiet of my porch, as the lake shimmered under the stars, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how long this road stretched, no matter how many hearings or legal hurdles were left, I wasn't stopping until it was finished. Not for me, for Ranger. The day of sentencing arrived with a crisp clarity, the kind of blue morning that made the lake sparkle like glass. Ranger sat beside me on the porch as I tied my boots, his tail tapping a slow, steady rhythm against the wooden boards. He didn't know what the day meant, but he felt my energy, steady, resolved, and finally, for the first time in months, unburdened. The courthouse was busier than it had been for the hearings. Reporters lined the steps, microphones angled, cameras ready. Neighbors, too, some who had once defended Karen, others who had quietly suffered under her rule, showed up not to take sides, but to witness an ending. Karen arrived late again, though her entrance didn't carry the same swagger it once had. Her purple suit looked stiff, her hair perfectly styled, but her eyes betrayed her. The sharp confidence she'd wielded for years was gone, replaced with a haunted flatness, like she was only just beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. Inside, the judge didn't waste time. The charges were read again, each word, landing with the finality of a door slamming shut. Animal cruelty. Assault on a federally protected service animal. Reckless endangerment, the prosecutor spoke first, outlining the facts one last time. The vet reports, the chemical analysis, the witness statements, it was all there, a chain of evidence so complete that there was nothing left for Karen's defense to argue. Then came my statement. I stood, my hands steady, Ranger's vest in one hand. I spoke not about anger, not about revenge, but about the cost. The cost of hearing my service dog cry out in pain. The cost of nights spent watching him tremble, unsure if the damage would fade. The cost of living in fear that someone could so easily weaponize cruelty against something so innocent. I spoke about Ranger, his loyalty, his quiet strength, the way he'd carried me through moments most people never see, and about how no one, not in this community, not anywhere, should have to fear for the safety of the companion that keeps them alive. When I sat down, the courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The judge leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. She spoke of responsibility, of the weight of what had been done, and of the law. She reminded everyone that harming a service animal wasn't just an offense against one person, but against every person who relies on these animals to navigate their lives safely. And then she handed down the sentence: fines, steep ones, restitution for Ranger's medical bills and for the emotional distress the incident had caused. Mandatory community service, specifically tied to animal welfare organizations, and, most notably, probation with strict conditions that would keep her movements and behavior under watch for the next 2 years. No jail time, though. Some neighbors grumbled at that, muttering that it wasn't enough, that she'd gotten off easy. But I knew better, because what Karen had really lost wasn't just her case. It was her power. Her reputation was in shreds. The HOA board she'd lorded over for years had dissolved weeks earlier, the remaining members voting unanimously to disband rather than try to rebuild under her shadow. The neighbors she'd ruled through fear and intimidation now crossed the street to avoid her. Contractors wouldn't take her calls. Businesses in town had quietly cut ties, and that, in many ways, was a harsher sentence than any cell could have delivered. When we walked out of that courthouse, Ranger at my side, the crowd that had gathered didn't cheer or jeer. They simply parted, letting us through, the silence thick with a kind of quiet respect. Outside, reporters tried to corner me, asking for statements, asking if I thought justice had been served. I didn't give them sound bites. I just said the only thing that mattered: it's over. Because, for me, that's what the day had been about. Not revenge, not humiliation. Closure. Back at the cabin, the lake was calm, the air warm with the promise of summer. I sat on the porch, with Ranger curled at my feet, the weight of months of tension finally beginning to lift. And as the days passed, the shift in the community became impossible to ignore. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's neck, people began to live again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started sharing coffee on porches. Kids rode their bikes along the roads without parents worrying about fines for unsafe play. The park, once a barren, overregulated patch of grass, filled with families. Again! And the repairs? They got done, not because anyone was threatened or fined, but because people came together, pooling their time and skills to keep the place running. The boat dock was fixed by a retired carpenter. The walking trail was cleared by a group of teenagers looking to earn some extra cash. The entrance sign, long faded and forgotten, was repainted by a pair of neighbors who wanted to bring some pride back to the community. What had been built on fear was slowly being rebuilt on trust, and every morning, as I walked Ranger down the now quiet trail, I saw the proof in every wave, every smile, every casual good morning that drifted across the lakefront. Ranger, for his part, healed in his own time. The physical pain faded quickly, but the fear took longer. Loud noises still made him flinch for a while, and he avoided the patch of grass where it had all happened. But with patience, and time, and more treats than I care to admit, the old confidence came back. His tail wagged higher, his eyes brightened, and his stride grew sure again. Watching him, I realized something that surprised me. This fight had changed me too. I'd gone into it angry, ready to battle, ready to prove a point. But somewhere along the way, I'd found something else: clarity. The kind that comes when you realize that standing your ground isn't about winning or losing. It's about refusing to be afraid. And that, I think, was what finally broke Karen. Because for years, she'd thrived on that fear, on the silence. On the way, people averted their eyes and bit their tongues and let her have her way, just to keep the peace. But the moment someone stood up and said, "No more," the power she thought she had evaporated. By midsummer, the empty HOA office had been torn down, the gravel lot cleared, and in its place, neighbors planted a small garden, bright flowers, a bench, and a simple wooden sign that read, "For everyone, always." The first time I walked past it with Ranger, a breeze rippling across the water, I stopped and sat on that bench for a while, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Not just from Karen, or the HOA, or the weight of the fight, but from the quiet anger I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The community had changed. Ranger had healed. And so had I. By the time summer gave way to autumn, the lake had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. The drama, the shouting, the endless tension that had hovered over every conversation, it was gone. What replaced it was quiet, the good kind, the kind of quiet where you could sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, Ranger curled at your feet, and hear nothing but the soft slap of water against the dock and the rustle of pine trees in the breeze. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was steady. Neighbors who had spent years walking on eggshells started rediscovering what it meant to simply live. Morning joggers waved as they passed. Kids, no longer chased off the walking trails, played tag in the park until the sun dipped low behind the trees. The air felt lighter somehow, as if the lake itself had let out a long, tired breath it had been holding for years. The empty gravel lot where the HOA office had once stood became the symbol of that change. At first, it was just an open space, weeds creeping in, the faint outline of the old foundation still visible. But then the neighbors came together. Not because anyone told them to, but because they wanted to, and turned it into something new. By mid-September, a garden bloomed there. Bright marigolds, wildflowers, and low shrubs lined the edges, with a small wooden bench in the center and a sign that read, "For the community, for all of us." The first time I walked past it with Ranger, he tugged gently at the leash and sat by the bench, his head tilted as if he sensed the peace there. I sat with him for a while, letting the stillness sink in. For the first time since that awful morning when he'd yelped in pain on the trail, I felt the last of the tension in my shoulders loosen. Life began to feel normal again. Not the tense, false normal of life under the HOA's thumb, but the kind of normal where days blurred together in the best way. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, Ranger watching the ducks drift lazily across the water. Afternoons were for fixing little things around the cabin, tightening the dock railing, sanding the porch boards, cleaning out the gutters before the fall rains came. Evenings were spent in quiet, either with a book in hand or walking the shoreline while the sun dipped below the hills and the water turned to glass. Ranger healed, too. The physical scars had faded weeks ago, but the hesitation in his gait, the way he flinched at sudden noises, took longer to fade. I worked with him patiently, day after day, rebuilding that confidence one small step at a time. By October, the dog I knew had come back, tail high, stride sure, eyes bright and steady. Sometimes I'd catch him sprawled in the sun near the our dock, his chest rising and falling in a slow, contented rhythm, and I'd think about how close I'd come to losing him. That thought still hit me hard, but now it carried less anger and more gratitude. Gratitude that he was still here. Gratitude that we'd made it through. The community noticed the change too, without Karen and her board casting their shadow. Over everything, people started to remember what it meant to be neighbors instead of opponents. When the first cold snap of the season rolled through, folks checked in on the older residents, chopping wood or dropping off groceries without anyone asking. When the boat dock needed repair after a late storm, a half-dozen people showed up with tools and spare boards, working together quietly until it was sturdy again. It was as if the lake was teaching all of us how to start over. The irony wasn't lost on me that, in some strange way, Ranger had become the quiet hero of that change. People stopped to greet him on our walks, kids asked to pet him, and neighbors still brought treats when they came by to chat. He didn't understand any of it, of course. He was just happy to wag his tail and lean into the attention. But I did. I understood that in fighting for him, I'd somehow given the entire neighborhood permission to stop being afraid. And maybe that was the real victory. Karen, for her part, faded into the background. After the sentencing, she put her house on the market. It sold quietly a month later, the SUV that had been her constant companion disappearing from the neighborhood one afternoon and never returning. No one celebrated. No one jeered. It was just over. And in that quiet ending, there was a kind of justice. Because the real punishment hadn't been the fines or the probation. It was losing the one thing she'd built her life around. Control. By the time the first frost dusted the grass along the shoreline, the neighborhood had fully settled into its new rhythm. The laughter of kids on the trail no longer sounded like rebellion. It sounded like life. The quiet nods from neighbors, passing on the road, no longer carried the weight of fear. They carried a sense of shared peace. I found myself smiling more, too. Not the tight, polite smile I'd worn out of habit during the years of constant conflict, but the kind of smile that sneaks up on you when you realize that somehow you've made it through the storm and found solid ground again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange over the water, I sat on the dock with Ranger beside me, a glass of iced tea in hand. The air was cool, the first hints of winter creeping in, but the moment was warm, steady, grounding. I thought about everything we'd been through, the fear, the anger, the endless tension of that fight, and I realized that somewhere along the way, the battle had stopped being about just us. It had become about something bigger, about showing that fear doesn't get to win, about proving that even in the face of cruelty, you can stand your ground and build something better on the other side. And maybe that's what made the quiet feel so different now. It wasn't just the absence of noise or conflict. It was the presence of something stronger. Peace earned, not given. As the stars began to prick the sky and the lake shimmered in the moonlight, Ranger shifted closer, his head resting on my knee. I reached down, running my hand over the soft fur at his neck, and felt that familiar swell of gratitude. Gratitude for him. Gratitude for this place. Gratitude for the simple, steady truth that we'd come through the fire and found something better waiting on the other side. And in that moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what storms might come in the years ahead, no matter what challenges might rise again, this ground, our ground, was solid. Because we'd fought for it. And we'd won. Not in the way people measure victory in headlines or verdicts, but in the way that truly matters. Quiet mornings, safe trails, a lake that feels like home again, and the simple, steady rhythm of a life lived without fear.